Welcome back to Past and Presents. This is our second European-hosted episode from our World War I trip. This week on Past and Presents, we're talking about historians and their role in the church, so we thought it might be appropriate to take you to a few European churches. We're going to start here in London with St. Paul's Cathedral. A little bit about St. Paul's. There's been a church here since at least 604 when a missionary named Augustine consecrated the first Anglo-Saxon bishop. There was a church in the Middle Ages, but it was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. 9 years later, construction began on a new updated cathedral designed by the famous architect Sir Christopher Wren. It took about 25 years to build and remains one of the largest churches in England and one of the highest domes in the world. It's truly beautiful. We can't film inside, but if you're ever in London, certainly take the chance to go here or do as we did and go and worship here because it remains an active center of worship. Famously, during World War II, it was a target of the Germans during the Blitz. It was struck twice by bombs, but mostly survived. There's an iconic image of St. Paul's amidst the billowing smoke and fire of the Blitz as a kind of symbol of English nationalist defiance. And if you go out by the south transept of St. Paul's, you'll see a memorial to the firefighters who died fighting the fires of the Blitz. Okay, let's begin our conversation for this week on historians and the role that they might play within the church. Okay, this week on Past and Presents, I'm back with Amy Popka to have, I think, a final conversation for the two of us about historians in the church. So I'll start with one of our textbook authors, Tracy McKenzie, who, in another capacity, not in this book so much, has suggested that Christian historians have a dual vocation. They have a calling to serve the academy, but they also have a calling to serve the church. So as a starting point, I wonder if that resonates with you, and if so, what that looks like to you. You know, those separate callings, are they kind of tandem callings? What does that mean to you?
As I thought about this question, I kept, I felt like I was trying to sort of categorize and say, okay, well, how do I think about this in terms of the academy and the work I do there, and then the church? And then I found that they just sort of kept overlapping in terms of the fact that I do think they're sort of, that they're a dual mission. I think that as a Christian historian, no matter what your topic is, you do have this sort of dual responsibility to say, I serve the academy in one respect, and that is to contribute to a growing field of knowledge as accurately and as honestly as possible. When I think about how I translate into that church, it's how do we continue to grow the Christian community to be accurate and helpful, and to say, how do we contribute to the church's mission? And so I think, but at the same time, I feel like those spheres are overlapping. Mm-hmm. So for me, they tend to sharpen each other. So I have found that, the work I'm doing specifically that relates to my sort of academic study is always having an influence on what I feel called to do when it comes to how I use my skills as a historian or my passion for being a historian in the church. And then at the same time, whenever I walk away from the specific experiences I have that are related to that aspect of who I am, I find that then they in turn have an impact on the way that I write and the way that I feel like I'm doing my academic work. Sure. And so, how is that for you?
Yeah. I forgot I'd be interviewed here too. I very much resonate with this. And I resonate with kind of the sharper edge of what he was trying to say, which is that to a certain extent, evangelical historians at least have maybe focused more on the academic calling simply because for a long time they weren't part of the academy.
Right.
And they were trying to do history well and to play by the rules of the game, George Marsden put it. And I think Tracy was trying to...
And you happen to be a Christian who's doing it.
Well, right. But, I mean, those control beliefs, for example, shape the questions you're asked. But, I mean, I think what Tracy was suggesting is it's possible to focus so much on that you might neglect the mission to the church.
Yes.
And I think I resonate with what you're saying about overlapping mission. They're sharpening each other. I also do think you communicate differently in those two places. And I wonder, especially with you, like, there's like the academic versus general audience problem, but I mean, especially when you're in a church setting, I mean, do you feel like you do your work as a historian differently than you would if you were at a academic conference or even in a classroom?
Yes, I think so. I think that for me, when you move it into the church setting, as much as sort of in the classroom, even though we happen to teach at a Christian in a Christian context, I try to, as much as possible, the work that I produce, the materials that I use, these are things that are respected within the academy and are contributing to, and the academic work that I'm doing is contributing to that academy. At the same time, in the conversations that I have with students, and this is for me part of faith integration learning and what that means, and then specifically within sort of the church environment, I am comfortable with sort of we statements because I feel like there has to be a relatability to the audience, but I'm comfortable using we because I think that part of my role in that capacity, and I always say both to students as well as to say a Sunday school group or whomever, there's no question I'm going to ask you I'm not asking myself. There's no wrestling that I'm going to ask you to do that I am not doing myself, but that I see a big part of that work of bringing in a sense of conviction and a sense of self-reflection. And while I don't necessarily see that as my role within the academy to do that, I do see that as my role within the Christian community to say, we're talking about these particular issues and where have we failed? Let's be honest about where we failed. Let's be honest about what we think and how this has been a struggle. And so for me, that's much more a part of the work that I do there. The content doesn't change though. And something that I've always felt very convicted by is to say, before I enter into any space to talk about Islam, which is not my religion, and to talk about Muslims who I am not a Muslim, it's important to me to really pray and to say, God, help me to make sure that the way that I present this is accurate and that I would not have one Muslim friend or colleague or even anyone from the academy who would be distraught or uncomfortable with what I'm presenting. So the content does not change at all. The way I might use the content to help us be self-reflective or to feel convicted is different.
My name is Austin Satram, and I graduated from Concordia College with a social studies education degree, and didn't actually go into teaching, but did 1 year of full-time ministry, and then worked 1 year, and then decided to come to seminary and pursue a Master of Divinity degree. So I'm currently a year and a half into the Master of Divinity degree here at Bethel Seminary. Seminary, I think what I've been learning most recently and most profoundly is that seminary isn't just for those who are called to vocational ministry, as we like to call it, or many times often call it. I've been convicted to call it Christian service because I think we're all called to ministry, whatever the context, whether you're a banker, farmer, plumber, teacher, historian, we're all called to ministry. And so seminary, yes, it does a great job of training pastors, but it also does a great job of training those who are going into the workforce to have a deeper theological understanding, to just simply understand how to connect with those who aren't of the Christian faith, to share the gospel appropriately, effectively, lovingly, graciously, to be better leaders that influence others and spread the gospel. And so seminary is a much broader education than I think a lot of people realize, a lot of students. At least when I was an undergrad, I thought, seminary is for either for those who are going to teach within a seminary, academic setting, or pastors. But it's so much more. It's beneficial for anyone, whatever vocation, whatever job God is calling you to.
Welcome back to our tour of European churches. We've moved on to what's perhaps the greatest example of a Gothic cathedral. This is the small town of Chartres. In the High Middle Ages, this was probably 10,000 people, but it had a bishop, so it had a cathedral. It also had a relic, the veil of Mary, the birth gown that she wore at the Nativity, and so it drew just hordes of pilgrims here. There was a Romanesque cathedral here in the 11th and early 12th century, but it burned down in startling fire, and they decided to rebuild an even grander Gothic cathedral, which they finished in a relatively quick 60 years. So it's a relatively homogeneous Gothic look, although some features are added later in the Middle Ages or even as far as the 1700s. It's really a stunning example of engineering. You go inside and you just can't believe, how can the nave be 120 feet tall, and how can the walls be so thin to accommodate all the stained glass? And the stained glass is remarkable. It's mostly from the 1200s. About 80% of it is original. They took it out during the two world wars that wouldn't be destroyed by artillery, or in World War II desecrated by the Germans. If you ever get a chance to go to Europe, it's about an hour west by train from Paris. It's well worth the 16 euros each way to come like a pilgrim and to just sit in kind of awe and wonder at the majesty of Chartres. Okay, we'll be back with another French church after this interview.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, China, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
My name is Andene O'Neil. I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross, and I was a Bethel history major. I was a music education major. I really, really loved music, and I loved every other class I was taking. And I also was taking a class called CWC and really, really enjoyed that as well. In fact, so much, partly because it was a multidisciplinary thing. A lot of people maybe look at history and assume it's names and dates, but the CWC class kind of showed me that studying history in an in-depth way, especially when you incorporate aspects of theology and philosophy and the arts into just chronologically what happened over the course of time, you really sort of see God's hand unfolding the story of the world. And I found it super interesting. I became a CWC TA, and I think shortly after that, I just felt I had to switch my major to history. I never looked back. I was a CWC TA, and I also was a musician, and sometimes to help myself remember things for tests, I would just write little ditties for myself to remember. And I had written this one little song to remember the Enlightenment to the Scientific Revolution to the Industrial Revolution, that whole progression. To make a long story short, a fellow TA basically totally pranked me and told a lecturing professor that he told me that a lecturing professor was waiting for me to come in and play this song as an example. And I was very embarrassed and didn't want to do it, but he convinced me, no, Dr. Bilby is waiting for you. And so I ran in with my guitar in front of everyone in CC 313, and Dr. Bilby had no idea that I was going to be coming in there, and it was kind of embarrassing, but I played that song, and I think it helps people remember some of those John Locke's and whatnot, but I was known for the next 2 years as the girl who wrote a CWC song. Being a CWC TA is an extremely valuable experience for anyone who has any interest in, teaching in any way, or just kind of tutoring or helping people come to understand ideas that they would perhaps assume are beyond them. And I think history is a unique example of that, because there are a lot of people who just assume, I'm not a history person. I guess I just have to memorize this stuff. And if you memorize history, you truly won't get it or understand the point or the value of it. And so some of my favorite moments were working with a few students who just assumed they had to survive CWC, and to see their faces light up when they got the difference between Plato and Aristotle or what have you. Currently, I'm the pastor of worship at this church, pastor of worship and adult ministries. Honestly, if you would have asked me when I was at Bethel if I would have been a worship leader years down the road, I would have said, no, probably not. I loved being a worship leader. I was a Vespers leader at Bethel and led worship in another job while I was in seminary. But just sort of did it because that's what I liked doing on the side, but I was really interested in, again, this multidisciplinary approach to both study and work and ministry. Well, I realized I had too narrow of a view of what working in a church or worship ministry is. And in this church, it's an Anglican church, I get to draw on everything I learned as an undergrad and then also in my seminary. And yes, I lead music every Sunday. They value writing music here and really interesting arranging of music or whatnot. So that's, of course, invigorating. But that's not the only reason I'm here. And I do pastoral care. I teach. I preach. I develop curriculum. I work with adult education so that we can educate and provide community for our adults. And I find it just really a life-giving place. I would say to be curious about everything. Like, there's a why and a how come and a trail behind any sort of current situation. And I think that history is just such a broad topic, but you can find yourself following little detective paths and discovering things that really enhance your understanding of the present if you take the time to stop and ask why and research and do some digging, and it's enriching, yeah. An awareness of how God works, I think. There is unfortunately sometimes a sort of purposeful amnesia that some people maybe have, and maybe in my generation or younger generations, because what's new might be coolest or most important. But with an awareness of the past or awareness of history, you see the context behind everything, and you sort of maybe even have compassion for where things aren't right yet. You maybe also have hope for where things can change, instead of just taking the present as, well, this is the way it is. You kind of see multiple layers. It's like seeing in 3D, I guess, is what I'd say. Write your papers well. And I mean that, my advice for first-year history majors would be to take any research project as a challenge to really, really learn and write well. I think that coming out of high school, sometimes there's a temptation to view any project as a task that just needs to be completed. But if you're a history major, typically you read a lot and you write a lot. And if you view the books you have to read or the papers you have to write as simply just things to make sure you get done, then you're going to miss out. But if you really view the library as like a magical place of wonder, or view research as an opportunity to really grow as a person, you'll learn so much about yourself as well as your topic when you're writing.
I think gender studies would be a great fit for a history minor because it gives students a chance to explore outside of the traditional canon of historical readings that we use and historical voices that we look at. In gender studies, we're thinking about how our views of gender and our different concepts have been shaped by history, but how those also shape history and social structures, and so how there's a cyclical relationship between them. And so one of the things we're mindful of is thinking about why haven't women's voices been present in historical documents or very vocal in historical documents, and how has that shaped our understanding of who men and women are in society, and how might we think about changing that in the future. There are 2 required courses in the minor. The first of those is Intro to Gender Studies, which is a philosophy class. And so in that class, we're working on understanding definitions and terminology, the difference between gender, sex, and sexuality. We are looking at the historical ways in which some of those concepts have been shaped, but we're also using our critical thinking skills to evaluate those concepts and to understand some of the bias and presuppositions that go into how we define some of those really key terms. And also we're looking at how they shape 20th and 21st century social structures. Students then go on to also take a required course in history of sexuality and get a chance to specifically focus on women in American history in that course. And then students have the opportunity to choose to take additional courses from a wide range of electives. And then something that's really exciting and unique about the Gender Studies program is that students get to do a gender tag course, which means whatever student's major or minor is, they can pick a course that they're taking as part of that and do one of their research projects in the course specifically on a theme related to gender.
Welcome back to France. We've moved back to the capital city of Paris, and what is probably a familiar sight to many of you, the facade of Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame is actually a very common name for cathedrals in France. We were just at Notre Dame de Chartres. It just means Our Lady. Many Gothic cathedrals are dedicated to the Virgin Mary because of the central place of Mary in medieval piety. Notre Dame de Paris is a little bit different than the one in Chartres. It's still high Gothic. It takes 200 years to construct. It starts in the mid-12th century and ends in the mid-14th century in the middle of the 100 Years' War. It's a majestic structure, 200-foot tall towers, which you might know from the movies, if nothing else. We'll skip ahead a little bit in history and just talk about the modern history of Notre Dame. During the French Revolution, Notre Dame is really a centrally contested site for the de-Christianization campaign of the more radical phase of the French Revolution. In 1792, it actually is rechristened, so to speak, a Temple of Reason. And near the end of that year, there's a whole ceremony in which an actress plays the goddess of reason, and they build something like a Greek temple on the altar itself. So worship is suspended for several years. It resumes kind of as we move into the Napoleonic period. And famously in 1804, this is where Napoleon crowns himself Emperor of the French. Okay, let's continue our conversation about historians in the church. Then we'll be back at the end of the episode in a different part of Europe for one last, very different kind of church visit.
So, I mean, as we end the first part of the conversation, you suggest that one calling Christians might have as historians in the church is to help churches be reflective and maybe even face up some chapters of history they don't want, or some boundaries that are difficult to negotiate. In the class, in both the books we've read, we've heard the distinction between history and heritage, and Americans might tend to prefer a heritage, a useful, convenient kind of past. I mean, does that resonate with your experience of churches? I mean, do American Christians perhaps prefer a church history that's more like heritage?
Yeah, I think that's true. But I don't. I'm affectionately critical of that because I think that's what we all do. I think, what is church? Church is ultimately, we hope, a family. And thinking back to what I said about my grandfather's memories, as a family, we want to instill a sense of heritage, and we tend to like to ignore the parts of our history that are uncomfortable for us, or that we aren't that we are either we don't want to face up to, or because we have no good excuses for them, or because they remind us of our sinfulness. And I do think that the church ignores it. And I think that something I see a lot of, and again, I put this on myself as well, is that we tend to have a do as we, look at what we say, not what we do, kind of mentality. And so that's tricky. I mean, you have to be, I think, very careful with that, because I know, again, in my work with churches, I always kind of like, if I'm talking to a Sunday school, I like to have 2 or 3 weeks as opposed to one, because I realize a lot happens as we start to get into a different frame of mind of thinking about, well, how can you hold the truth of history, which I think is history's job, is to remind us of the truth, but how do you hold history and heritage together and find a peace between them? But I do think that it's something that, at least in my own experience, and I say this because I'm a member of the Christian church, so I think the Christian church struggles with this, and I actually feel like there's lots of conversations that are happening right now, and maybe it's because of, maybe it's because of global events, maybe it's because of technology, I'm not sure, but it seems like this is becoming it's an uncomfortable, but it's becoming more of a part of a conversation than I feel like than it has for a while anyway.
Yeah, I often say I was invited to give a talk at our church's family camp once, and I asked, well, what do you do at these talks? And the guy who was arranging it said, well, usually it's someone who comes in and gives an inspiring talk. And I said, I don't really inspire people. That's not really what historians are good at. Now, having reflected a little bit more on that, I think there is a degree to which maybe that is a purpose of what you do. I mean, you are there to remind people of the community at its best.
Yes.
Too. I mean, being an objective historian is not to be a purely critical historian.
Yes.
However, I think more often what's needed is we're there to convict people, to challenge people, and at the very least to help them remember well. I've thought a lot about the way memory is discussed in the book of Deuteronomy, which isn't a book I would normally read, except that again and again it keeps coming back to do not forget, remember this, and it often is very uncomfortable memories. It's remember you were a slave in Egypt, remember how you oppressed these people, or before you oppressed the people, remember how you were a slave once at some point. And I feel like that is maybe a big part of our calling, is to help these communities remember well, and remember things they would probably rather discard or gloss over. And that's a difficult thing to do, but as a part of the community, I'd rather, I just don't think you can be the church well if you're not willing to confront that, because otherwise you're building up this false thing called the church. And no wonder then you alienate people who think the church is hypocritical and legalistic and judgmental.
No, absolutely. Our pastor recently gave a sermon. Our church supports a ministry here in Minnesota that focuses on sex trafficking and human trafficking. And our pastor gave a sermon, and it was to sort of help us focus on this ministry and introduce this ministry. And then, but the pastor's sermon also dealt with, he brought up, he was actually reading the first Thanksgiving that we use, and coincidentally, and he also was talking about then other research that he'd done regarding European treatment of native populations, and also the coming of Columbus, and really looking at what happened in Hispaniola. And he spoke about this in church, and he said that he had wrestled with the fact that he thought of all of the different sort of controversial, hot topic type of things that have come up in his ministry over the years, or to confront, say, in a sermon. This was the most difficult for him, that he was the most nervous about it because of this exact thing that you're talking about, this notion of, but facing up to, how do we face up to these things and then yet still feel a sense of pride in our heritage? And so, I mean, I was very proud of that sermon, but it was interesting because you could feel, and even though I think this is a congregation, like I said, I've seen just in 2 years wrestle with really difficult issues, you could feel this sense of uncomfortableness with confronting something that is provable, but yet it challenges our sense of heritage. And that is something we're really uncomfortable with.
So as we wrap up, maybe we can put this away from ourselves and put it on our students. A theme that we've talked about just throughout the semester in Chartres History, and it's going to be the topic of their last essay, is calling. I mean, who are you called to be as a person? How is your education shaping that? But also, what are you called to do with these passions you've been given for the past? That maybe that curiosity is not an accident. And so, I mean, I've said at a few points in the class, most of these students will not actually be professional historians. You know, some will teach history, some might work in museums or archives, but most will actually do occupations. But I guess I would hope that they are part of faith communities, and that there might be some connection then between these passions and the training they've received. So, as historians who may be in churches, what is a piece of advice you would give them? How can they serve the church as people who have been trained to think historically, who have an interest in the past? What's the best thing they can do?
I think the best, well, I don't know that I can come up with the best thing, but I think that the role that historians are equipped and trained to play is that idea of we don't forget. Our job is to hold on to memory. It is to not let things be forgotten. It's to have appreciation and a value for what has come before. And I think of the strategic importance of having people who serve on church committees, who serve in any capacity of leadership at the church, to whenever new ideas come, as great as new ideas are, but to have those voices that say, but let's look at where we've come from. Let's look at what we've done before. Let's be honest about where things have gone well. Let's be honest about where things have not gone well. And to always understand that you're fixed in a particular place and time, but yet the challenge is, I think, and I love this is something I really enjoy about history, is what's my responsibility to those who have come before me, and what's my responsibility to those who will come after. And so I think that anybody who is trained with these skills is in the prime position to be able to serve their church in that capacity.
We've come to the end of this episode, and also very near the end of our World War I trip. Even though the class is about World War I, we push forward into the 1920s, 30s, and 40s when we come to Munich, Germany. So we talk about the rise of a war veteran named Adolf Hitler, who of course becomes the leader of the National Socialist movement, and that takes us to World War II, into the Holocaust. And so we end our trip, and we end this episode at Dachau, at the former site of the concentration camp that existed from 1933 to 1945. It's very different, of course, than the other places we've been in this episode. Glorious cathedrals like St. Paul's and Chartres and Notre Dame. But I think it's a good reminder of a couple of things. First of all, that The church is not a building. The church is a group of people who have been given a mission, and that is to be the body of Christ in this world, to be his hands and his feet, to be comfort to those who are afflicted and suffering. And you definitely get the sense of affliction and suffering as you stand on what's pretty sacred ground here at Dachau. And so as we think about what is the role of the historian within the church, how do we serve the church and serve others through it, we certainly want to think about how historians then serve the mission of God in this world. I think one of our missions is within the church is to remind the people of the church that throughout time and space, Christianity has been a force for good, but it's been a force for evil as well. And we certainly see that on this trip. We're reminded certainly of the way that Christianity was used to justify the slaughter of the war and the hatred and the vengeance that fueled it. But even before that, how Christianity was used to justify the enslavement of whole peoples, the exploitation of the working poor and of children. And of course, how it's used to justify the anti-Semitism and the hatred that makes places like this possible. And so maybe that's a big part of what historians are supposed to do for the church, to chasten it, to help it not forget. So a sober moment as we come to the end of this episode. But there is hope, even in this place. There are actually churches behind us. There are Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Russian Orthodox chapels. And next week, I think we'll maybe come to a more hopeful place, which is, what is the vocation of the historian? What is your calling? And a big part of this class is helping you get a sense early in your time at Bethel of what has God called you to do, and how are your studies in your major, your minor, or elsewhere at Bethel preparing you for that work. So looking forward to continuing that conversation next week on our last episode of Past and Presence.
Back, baby, back in time, wanna go back when you were mine. Back, baby, back in time.